started. Thank you for being here today at the Southwest Center series. We're delighted to have with us Dr. Natalie Koch. I met Natalie recently at a little seminar on interdisciplinary desert studies at the University of Notre Dame, and I was impressed and really excited to bring her to the Southwest Center. So I'm grateful for support from both the Southwest Center and the Center for Middle and Near Eastern Studies for sponsoring this lecture. Dr. Natalie Koch is a political geographer focusing on authoritarianism, geopolitics, nationalism and identity politics, and resource governance. Dr. Koch is currently Associate Professor in Geography and the Environment at Syracuse University's Maxwell School of Citizenship and Public Affairs. She's the author of numerous books. It's really incredible how productive you've been, including Spatializing Authoritarianism 2022 from Syracuse University Press, and The Geopolitics of Spectacle, Space, Synecdoche, and the New Capitals of Asia 2018 from Cornell University Press. And her forthcoming book, which she'll be speaking from one of the chapters I understand of that text, is Arid Empire, The Entangled Fates of Arizona and Arabia, from Verso, expected later this year, if I'm correct. Dr. Koch is also a scholar of sport and sports geography and is herself an accomplished competitive cyclist in the USA and Canada, was a member of the pioneering cycling team, Team Novo Nordisk. And she's published in numerous prestigious journals, including Geoforum, Antipode, Annals of the American Association of Geographers, and Political Geography. Dr. Koch has received support for her research from the National Science Foundation, Fulbright, and the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation. We're so lucky to have some time today with Dr. Koch. The title of her talk is Saudi Arabia, Desert Geopolitics and the Entangled Fates of Arizona and Arabia. Welcome, Dr. Koch. Thanks for being here.
Thank you, Robin, for the generous introduction, and also to the Southwest Center for hosting me. And also, I would like to acknowledge that I am in Tucson at the moment. I'm from Tucson originally, and this is, as I hope all of us in this area know, the traditional homelands of the Tohono O'odham. So thank you for welcoming us to this place. And thank you all for listening in today. I will be speaking just on one of the case studies from this broader project that I've been working on about connections between Arizona and the Arabian Peninsula. So the bigger project will be coming out is a larger book later this year, as Robin mentioned. So if you're interested in that, or if you're interested in specific articles or other things that I've written about this particular case, then feel free to reach out, send me an email after the talk. Happy to be in touch with anybody that's interested. So with that, I will go ahead and share my screen for some visuals for today. And start the story of what we might think about Saudi Arizona and what I've been interested in this project, which really got me started from the beginning about this concept of desert geopolitics. I've been studying geopolitics. I'm a scholar of geopolitics for many, many years now, but often it's a rather narrow sort of approach to what that means in terms of thinking about state-to-state relations. To me, that's too simple. I've always tried to look for different angles on geopolitics and thinking about other kinds of connections and perspectives on that. And so being from Tucson originally, and then working in the deserts of Central Asia, and then later the deserts of the Arabian Peninsula, I started to really get interested in how you might see these different connections between desert places. But the story really actually got sparked for me empirically when I heard about the acquisition of the Saudi dairy company Almarai of this farm just outside of Vicksburg, or just in Vicksburg, Arizona, outside of the Phoenix metropolitan area. So when I first heard of this, I was just kind of surprised because I grew up in Tucson, but I hadn't been paying that much attention in recent years to water politics. And I sort of assumed that these sorts of deals would just not be happening today. That, I had this story growing up here that, we used to grow cotton, and we learned that that was not so smart. These water intensive crops sort of in my mind had gone away, but obviously that's not at all true. And so this really just sparked my interest in pursuing what was going on here. Why would a Saudi dairy company be acquiring a farm in Arizona to grow primarily alfalfa? But in addition to that, you can already see from this image from the Phoenix magazine, one of the articles about this from a Phoenix magazine article about the acquisition, that there's a kind of Orientalism built into the Western media presentation of what happened here with this particular deal that gets written into the images and the language surrounding this particular farm acquisition. So you can sort of feel that coming out here, that there's almost like the looming Saudi threat, which is a common storyline in the US media about the Saudi influence creeping into the US in particular ways. And as somebody who has been to Saudi Arabia, has worked on the Gulf countries, I understand that this is a very problematic discourse. And so I wanted to also understand how the media presentation of it was constructing this particular narrative of threat or danger, and what that actually meant in terms of the geopolitical side of the story, what was going on here. So this is just a Google view of where the farm is located if people are interested. Fondamonte is the subsidiary of Almarai Farms, which is the Saudi company. And this is one of the drone photos. I took my brother out there with his drone and got some good pictures of the site from the air. So you can see that they're largely growing alfalfa, but there's also some cattle that are on site as well. So this is just a bit of a sense of where this particular site is. But as you can see, this is obviously not a very, it's an area that requires a lot of external inputs of water to sustain any kind of agricultural production in the region. So that is also one of the reasons that a lot of the media coverage of this particular farm acquisition started to focus on the fact that, this was a kind of story of maybe not just land grabbing, but also water grabbing, that the Saudis were coming to get, as some of my relatives told me, our water. And I'll come back to that story of what counts as our water here. But there was this sort of threatening narrative that got woven into a lot of the media accounts about this, and that this was something that I think needed a lot more attention. And many of the stories about land grabbing of foreign companies or foreign countries coming in and acquiring the farmland of other people in other places has been framed as something very problematic through the language of a land grab. And the idea here is not necessarily wrong in and of itself. What I see as a scholar of geopolitics is the abstraction here of these particular hands. Whose hands are those? Who's doing the grabbing? Those are this sort of abstract, detached, bodiless figure is not sufficient if we are going to understand what is actually happening in terms of the geopolitical relations. We need to understand who those hands are. And just using these kind of easy, simplistic labels is not sufficient. So just trying to understand whose hands those are is really important in order to understand this. But this is a common narrative in academia, just as much as it is in the media, as well as then the sort of parallel concern with water and the idea of a land grab or a water grab or virtual water, where you can see that, okay, they're growing alfalfa at the Vicksburg farm, but really when they're exporting that alfalfa to Saudi Arabia, they're exporting our water because of the way that that agricultural relationship works connected with water. And so this idea of the water grab has been important in accounting for this story as well. I've been trying to get beyond this. So these sorts of metaphors, these geopolitical metaphors, are things that geographers like myself are interested in critiquing, but then you can't just critique it and say, well, that's insufficient. You have to think about, okay, well then how do you really understand what's going on here? I personally have found the most productive angle to this by looking at the political economy questions about and food geopolitics and the history of these relationships. And as I'll come back to a little bit later, this longer story of Arid Empire. So what does that mean? That means actually looking at these particular actors. So Almarai is the largest dairy company in the Middle East and the largest company in Saudi Arabia. So this is a major actor. This is the company that has Fondamonte as the subsidiary that owns that farm in Vicksburg. So Almarai is it's more than just a dairy company though. It's actually also a massive logistics firm essentially now. So many of the large Gulf dairy companies have transformed themselves into agricultural logistics hub. So they control anything from ports to grain silos and all sorts of logistics facilities and trucks. They have these massive networks across the world, not just in any given country. So when we're thinking about what they're doing, we also have to understand them as part of a broader political economy of food in the region. So this is some of their this is from the 2019 annual report from Almarai. You can see that they have presence in other parts of the world. I haven't checked recently if I think they still have the Romania farm. They've been doing some new deals in Europe, but their largest presence internationally is in the US and in Argentina. So in addition to the farm that they have in Arizona, they have a farm, I think it's near Blythe, that is the other major spot where they are growing alfalfa, and they're primarily shipping that back to Saudi Arabia for the cows that their cows live mostly in Saudi Arabia. So you can see that on this particular map here, where the headquarters, where the largest sort of holding of the cattle herds is in Al-Kharj. So Al-Kharj, as you can see from this, is just outside of Riyadh, the center of Saudi Arabia. So why Al-Kharj? Why would they have why would Saudi Arabia in the first place have such a large dairy company, and what is it doing in the middle of this very, very dry region of Saudi Arabia? So I've been trying to follow this story, not just in thinking about desert connections across space, so this contemporary story, but also thinking about this in terms of the history of it and thinking about these desert to desert connections across time. And it's when I started to look into the history of Al-Kharj that I started to see how these connections between Arizona and the Arabian Peninsula are much deeper and much longer than I previously had understood. So for this particular story, I'll just take us back to the U.S. agricultural mission of Carl S. Twitchell, who was a geologist who was actually a royal advisor to the Saudi king, Ibn Saud, and then later some of the other kings and the finance minister and others within Saudi politics in really beginning in the 1930s and then into the 1940s. So Carl Twitchell had actually spent a bit of time working in Arizona before he moved to Saudi Arabia, and actually before that he was in Yemen. So before he moved to the Gulf countries, he was working in the copper mines and really actually had gotten to know a bit about Arizona. And so he learned very quickly from his growing relationship with Ibn Saud that in fact he was, that this story of desert connection was really valuable and really important. So Twitchell actually convinced Ibn Saud to send him back to Arizona in 1941 to do a tour, an agricultural tour of the desert Southwest, so that Carl Twitchell could come back and give him some ideas about how to improve the Saudi agricultural environment. So there's plenty of records from Twitchell's papers at Princeton, which I got to look at this fall, where he's sort of recounting his trip and what he looked at when he went through parts of New Mexico and Arizona. And it was this then that sort of gave the seed for this idea that Carl Twitchell had of getting the US government to sponsor what is called the US Agricultural Mission of 1942. And so the report from that, which you see on the screen here, this came out in 1943. And essentially it just sort of gives this, expert story about how the Saudis can improve their agricultural environment. And as you can see on the other side, like from the cover page there, you can see a map. And this is the route that Twitchell and two of his colleagues who had been working for the US government in the agricultural sector as well, that they tracked, like sort of traced to this particular route through Saudi Arabia. For the most part, though, as you can see from Twitchell's diaries, they actually spent almost all of their time in Al-Kharj. Like the vast majority of the time was in Al-Kharj. And the reason for that is that Twitchell already knew from the beginning that this was the favorite project of King Ibn Saud and his finance minister, who was a really important person in promoting this particular project. And so they spent a huge amount of time there. And the idea here was that Twitchell was trying to set up this relationship between the growing Saudi leadership and the US, but doing that through agriculture. This is one of the major things that that Twitchell saw as an important contribution that he could make of building these relationships through the agricultural sector. And of course, you know, there's all the nice benefits of creating this kind of patronage relationship that many of us just assume at this time was exclusively about oil. It wasn't. It was more than that. It was much broader than that, and building these relationships. So this becomes Twitchell's sort of pet project. So when he's there at Al-Kharj, he is already sort of envisioning, okay, we can do this model project, and we can sell the American desert farming expertise through this. This is a picture from his diaries that again, these are from the Princeton papers that I was able to look at this fall. He already sort of on the bottom, you can see on the right-hand side there, he's already developing an organizational chart for this new project that he's going to set up, where you've got agricultural experts from the US coming together to help run this new farming operation. And essentially this is a vision that he has already, as you can see from how this is dated, in the middle of 1942. So the whole agricultural mission, if you read anything about this in Gulf history, and if you read anything about it in most accounts, it generally talks about it as a broader project. But from the beginning, it's clear from Twitchell's diaries that he had a vision of transforming the ag mission to really just being about how to sell this particular project in Al-Kharj, which again I'll come back to is not a project for Al Saudis. This is a project for the Saudi king, right? And he's there to facilitate that. So what comes out of this? What comes out of this in the first stage is that Twitchell proposes to send a team of Arizona farmers to Al-Kharj to basically take the roles that he's already outlined there in 1942. So he proposes to get this team of farmers who eventually include David Rogers and then several of his school friends from Arizona. And then another part of the sort of project that Twitchell has in trying to sell desert expertise between the Saudis and the US is that he also promotes these visits from the Saudi royal family members to come to Arizona. And so there's 2 royal family visits. The first happens from Prince Faisal in 1943, and then the second happens from Prince Khalid actually, no, those 2 princes come together in 1943, and then there's a second visit in 1947 from Saud al-Saud, and I'll talk about those here in a minute. So this first visit in 1943, there's very little press coverage on it. I've really struggled to find much about it, especially in the US, in the Southwest newspapers, there's very little. But I did eventually sort of later find in some other archives that Twitchell was actually very upset about how this was conducted. He wasn't given enough he wasn't consulted enough about how to sell Arizona's desert expertise to the Saudis. And so he has this long letter where he's sort of complaining that Arizona has all these agricultural insights that they could have offered to the Saudis, but that the US State Department people just botched it. So my suspicion is that it didn't get that much coverage because it wasn't being promoted along those particular lines. But nonetheless, the Saudi princes came to Arizona, looked at some Navajo sheep raising techniques and a few other sites visiting the Grand Canyon, for example. So that visit was kind of a flop. That wasn't going to be repeated the next go round, which we'll see in a minute. So between the first and the second royal family visits to Arizona, Twitchell does succeed in getting this team of Arizona farmers sent to Al-Kharj between 1944 and 1945. And so this was sponsored by the US government. And the idea here was that they were going to help set up this grand vision of a sort of spectacular site of agricultural production in the heartland of Saudi Arabia. So this is a map from a 1951 article that gives you a sense of what this project was. So a little bit later than the Arizona team was there. But as you can see, there's kind of the black sites are labeled as American developments. And then, there was multiple different kinds of fields that were dedicated to various crops, largely alfalfa and some other water intensive crops like wheat, etc., but also vegetables, all sorts of other things that would sort of need more technical kind of production to introduce into these desert landscapes, which you can see was a pretty austere space. So alfalfa was, as I said, one of the first things that the Arizona farmers wanted to introduce and to promote there. And the reason that they wanted to do this from the beginning was because this area is known for its sinkholes. So these large sinkholes, which you can see on the bottom right-hand side there, these are just these sort of natural formations where the Saudis had already started some agriculture in this region because the water was quite accessible there. So the Americans, first Aramco and then the Rogers team, started to help with developing some of the new technologies and pumping resources to get the water out of the ground. But because the water from the underground aquifers was more accessible in this particular region, this is why it was preferred. And it was then sort of slowly had become a a retreat area for the Saudi royal family members. So this is the kind of development that was going on in these pictures are a little bit later from the early 1950s, and this on the bottom right hand side, again, this is a departmental colleague of mine actually who preceded me. He died in the 1960s, but at Syracuse University, a very important geographer who had visited and I had found his records at Syracuse University. So these are some of the slides from his visit to the Al-Khard region in the early 1950s. So I'm happy to talk more about that, but we'll quickly move on. So as I said, there were other crops that they were growing besides just grains and then things like this. The watermelons were a particular favorite. The Saudi king liked to bring other royal families from neighboring countries, like the Kuwaitis were brought here to look at and marvel at their watermelons and load them up with watermelons to go back and show the miracle of farming that the Saudis were able to produce, and then promote this in other parts of the region. So this is something that they were very proud of and a demonstration of their kind of modernity. But a lot of the crops were not, they weren't really just for the masses, even though this is often how Twitchell and others would sort of frame the project, that Saudi Arabia needs to be able to produce food for all of its people. We have this large population and the people that are coming for the Hajj. We need to provide for the food security of the country. But most of these sorts of crops, like the vegetables, etc., they were going to the royal family in Riyadh. Almost all of it was getting sent to the thousands of royal family members that were in the Riyadh area. But other things that they were then distributing the grains to various animals in the region, including the king's horses. He kept, I think it was around 200, wonderfully exotic horses in the region. And so at first the grains were being used to feed the horses. But soon that transitioned to include cows. And this is where we start to see the rise of the Saudi dairy industry through the introduction of cows in Al-Khard. But first, to get to the cows and why we even see this interest eventually in cows, we have to come back to the Saudi royal family member tours in Arizona, because it is here that Saud al Saud gets interested in dairy farming and trying to bring that to Saudi Arabia. So he comes in 1947, and it's as opposed to the 1943 visit, a very big deal. And there's tons of press coverage about this, lots of stories in the Arizona newspapers, including in the Arizona Daily Star and others that are sort of talking about that are talking about this particular visit of the crown prince. And part of it is that he is the crown prince as opposed to just one of the princes in the royal family. So it's seen as something that is more important, but there's simply just more fanfare about this. So the ASU library has a fantastic collection of photos from this particular visit. These are just some of them. So like the previous visit, they were also taken to see some of the water infrastructure that was being developed or had more or less recently been developed in Arizona at the time. And so you have the Saudis visiting Boulder Dam, Hoover Dam, and just sort of looking around at some fields, all sorts of miscellaneous traipsing through various parts of the landscape, but also being wined and dined by various Phoenix notables, as you can see here, from Arizona Times and son-in-law, late President Roosevelt, and others that are sort of being brought into this to demonstrate the interest, the political interest in hosting the Saudis and building this connection, and I'll sort of just emphasize that this is a connection told on the story of the desert. right? That we have something here in our special knowledge as a place that in the Southwest being the American desert, and we can teach you, you similar desert people, how to engineer this in terms of the agricultural and the water infrastructure. So this is some in the DC area in Beltsville, Maryland, but one of my favorite pictures from this whole visit, that is, you know, it's the Crown Prince laughing with the Secretary of Agriculture. And at this time, just this idea that we have so strongly entrenched, at least many Americans have so strongly entrenched, that, yeah, US-Saudi relations are about oil and arms. They're also about laughing over chickens, apparently, and I think that this is honestly, I mean, I find this photograph hysterical for so many reasons, but it really does kind of decenter our assumptions about what and how these relationships are built, because many of these projects do go hand in hand with other sort of military or oil related concerns. And they are often brought together as kind of deal sweeteners or other ways to make these relationships more palatable from both sides. And I think that this is important that we not lose sight of what those projects are, because they also have serious implications. So as I said, coming back to the rise of the Saudi dairy industry, you see that is after Saud goes to Arizona, that he then comes back to Saudi Arabia wanting to start his own dairy industry and to get this kick started. At this point in time, the Arizona farmers had already left, but there were basically Aramco, the American Arabian oil company that then later becomes Saudi Aramco. Aramco at this point was controlling the farm. And so, yeah, Saud went to the Aramco managers and said, basically, we want to set this up. And so the Aramco folks dutifully obliged and imported cows primarily from the US, but various types of cows to help set this up, and quickly did so. And it became a really important, popular thing for the Saudis to have their own dairy production in the Arabian Peninsula. So I could say lots more about that, but I'll quickly move on here in the interest of time. So it is really out of this particular project that we start to see this interest in promoting agriculture in the Arabian Peninsula. And this expands really only from the 1950s into the 1970s. But one of the big things, and I think for me, the important lesson that comes out of Al-Kharj and this early project of Twitchell helping to support this very elite-centered agricultural initiative is that it is elite-centered, right? And that this is not necessarily about helping the small farmers. This is about promoting a particular project that the king and the crown prince are interested in. And the State Department documents from the 1940s say as much. Essentially, the State Department people who were sponsoring the early project are saying, like, we have to do what the king wants. We can't just say we're going to have this democratic project. We have to do what they are asking for, and that's what they're asking for here. The US government didn't end up renewing that particular funding. So maybe some people disagreed and thought that was not an acceptable use of money. It's not actually detailed in the archives. But in any case, this pattern gets established where many of these agricultural initiatives in Saudi Arabia, they end up focusing on or benefiting the elites who are interested in the sector rather than necessarily the small farmers. And so as the Saudi agricultural industry grows and the state starts to subsidize agriculture in a very significant way after the 1970s, thanks to various sort of crises in food supply, et cetera, this pattern just gets exaggerated. So with the introduction of these large subsidies, many small farmers are pushed out, and agriculture becomes an elite dominated industry. Big dairies thrive. Should I take, somebody raised their hand, should I take questions now immediately? If somebody has an immediate question, please speak up.
I did not see that.
Oh, okay. It just popped up, but maybe they will hold their question. Okay. So as a result of this, then you start to see that the folks in the larger dairies start to grow, and they start to benefit from these large subsidies, including Almarai, which gets its start also in the 1970s. And so it is really out of this that we start to see the growth of the dairy industry and their entrenchment in the broader agricultural sector in the region. So I don't have time to speak too much about this, but I'm happy to go into this at much more length. But in answering the sort of implicit question here of the CNN article is how and why are these big dairies thriving? Much of it is related to the oil industry, in the sense that oil revenue is being channeled through state subsidies to other sectors of the Saudi economy, including agriculture. So that's part of it. But you also have that the fact that these dairies and other parts of the agricultural sector are being subsidized in some sense by the Saudi aquifers, right? It is the groundwater that is allowing this sector to continue for an extended period of time. But as we, I hope, all know, aquifers don't last, right? If you tap them unsustainably, and so this is something that the Saudis have come up against, and this is one of the reasons that leads them back to Arizona, and in particular, looking for alfalfa and other cattle feed in other parts of the world, including here in Arizona. So there's many pieces of this story that I could detail that I don't have time for. I'm happy to answer questions about. But essentially, the Saudis realize that their aquifers are basically depleted some years back. And so by 2018, they had the final ban on domestic forage production, green forage production came into full effect. It had sort of been phased out for a while, but this was then what led companies like Almarai, as you can see in this particular story, that they're announcing from their side that they're complying with this with this particular ban. And how are they complying with that? They're complying with that by outsourcing their grain production and getting the grain from other parts of the world. And the acquisition of the Vicksburg farm is part of that story. So then this sort of again comes back to that question of why Arizona of all places. Yes, this history is interesting, but that doesn't necessarily, it's not like path determined by that history. But there are various features of growing alfalfa in a desert landscape that makes that much more appealing. And there's a series of push and pull factors. So on the push side, you've got the end of these subsidies that have been fueling domestic production of grain. You have the diminishing water supplies, and there's this a little piece about sustainability in there as well. But from the Arizona side also, then the agricultural folks in Saudi Arabia, they are also getting subsidies. They're getting a new kind of subsidy. The new subsidy is to acquire land overseas. So that's one reason to go overseas. But also one of the things that the Gulf, various people at various parts of the Gulf agricultural sector had learned quite early on, especially after the 2006 world food crisis, that if they just went out and willy-nilly bought farmland in all these various countries, which they did, many of those deals went south. And it was not a good political situation. There were all sorts of conflicts around them. So various lessons came out of that. One was to buy established farms so that you didn't have to do a sort of greenfield development of a farming operation. So to buy that where it's already in place, which is what Vicksburg was, right? It was already working as an alfalfa farm. The other was to go to places that are not going to be perhaps kicking the Saudis out because of political unrest, or that the countries might impose an export ban, or any other kind of major popular political opposition to it. This is where I think coming from Arizona helped me, in a sense, understand what was going on, why this seemed appealing to the Saudis, is that I know how contentious the water politics is in Arizona. And so many people that I first started talking to in Arizona would tell me, well, essentially, we can't change the water politics in Arizona because it's just it's such a mess. It's such a fight over any little direction that you might want to go. And so this kind of paralysis within Southwest water politics is actually really convenient for the Saudis, right? Because they can take advantage of that. They're not necessarily going to have major outcry and unity around one particular farming project. And as many people in Arizona have told me, there's other bigger fish to fry when it comes to water issues in the Southwest. This is just one small farm. Why are you even bothering with that, right? So this kind of bigger environment, political environment in Arizona, has supported and helped the Saudis get through with this particular project. And of course, there's also the fact that there's cheap and accessible water. So when they chose this particular farm, this is a location that is outside of an active management area. So they can pump groundwater here quite easily. They just needed to apply for new pumping permits for new wells. And they went straight ahead and drilled a bunch of new wells. And you can see that they're up and running and pulling out a lot more groundwater. So this was an easy solution for them in many ways to access Arizona groundwater. But going back to that story that I was hearing from relatives and from others about the Saudis coming to take our water, I think we need to be really careful when we use that particular language, especially when we are settlers on this land. I am a part of that settler history, right? My family came and in the 1950s, and I grew up here, and I think of this as my home. But we are living in Tohono O'odham lands. We are living in the lands that belong to many other indigenous communities long before. And so I think it is really important to understand that what this story is also a story that denies previous acts of water theft on the part of Arizona colonizers, essentially. And I think this is part of the much bigger project that I have been doing, is actually telling that longer history of Arizona's colonization through agriculture, through institutions like the University of Arizona, and how much of that is tied to taking control of the land through taking control of the water and controlling the agricultural production in the region. And so I think this question of who are we and whose water is this really at the end of the day is a very politically sensitive one, but it also demands that we put our attention not just on the here and now, but back to that history of Arizona's colonization by the United States in the mid 1800s. So I'll sort of leave this slide here because I could talk about each of these pictures for 20 minutes each. But as many of you presumably know, settling Arizona was not an easy project. And this is where the agricultural boosterism really came in and was quite important for developing the state. And so when you have things like this, where the agricultural boosters were talking about how fantastic it was that Arizona was becoming this great site for production, this map coming from I think this is from 1928, yes, and demonstrating how far all of these products from this land are going, and it is a very nationalistic story. This is a United States story. We're helping to feed the United States. That this is nonetheless a kind of colonial act of demonstrating this kind of production and sending these resources to other parts of the world. And I don't think that's entirely dissimilar from this particular map that I showed earlier of Al-Kharj, and where it is located, that we have a new sort of transnational dimension to this kind of story. And it is this kind of geopolitical lens that I think helps us think in a broader sense that this is not just a national story, and it's not just a story about today. This is a story about history, and that we have to think across space and time in order to really understand how this is working. And so this is a sort of desert geopolitics that I've been interested in, trying to subvert these conventional understandings of geopolitics by looking at things like agriculture and seeing how it can kind of shift our attention away from that very simple story of, oh, the Saudis are just coming to steal our territory or our water or whatever it is, right? That sells in the media, but it's way, way more complicated than that. And this, by understanding and approaching this in sort of trans-regional sense, I think it helps us to understand how empire works and how it has these pasts and presence, and that there are no easy victim villain storylines here, right? I think we need to refuse that easy solution. You know, there is no easy way of identifying who's the hero or who's the antagonist in this particular story. It might give us some moral comfort if we could position ourselves in one place versus the other, but there is a kind of complicity here. If we think about the Arizona farmers who helped set up the dairy industry and then really kicked that off with this relationship through Saudi Arabia, I mean, should we be surprised that the Saudis are coming back then and seeking to tap the water and the land to feed those cows back in Saudi Arabia today? I would dare say maybe we're not. And these are the kinds of colonial and settler colonial histories that I think are really important to think through together, that they are not just about the past, that they're also about the present. So that's sort of the bigger story that I try to tell in the book that will be coming out later this year. And for now, I will just try to be on time with my 45 minutes. And I'm happy to take any questions that people might have. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Dr. Koch. Thank you. That's fascinating. I also always appreciate all of the images that you're able to find and share. Were you able to include many images in your book as well?
Yes, I was, fortunately, yes.
Yeah, well, we'll look forward to that. There were a couple of questions about the small farmers. So Laura Goffman asked exactly who were the small farmers politically and demographically in Eastern Arabia and Arizona. And then we had a contribution to that from Kristen Ullman. Apologies if I mispronounce anyone's name. My experience in Saudi in the 1970s and early 80s was that small farmers herd goats and sheep and grow dates in existing locations with surface water, not a small farmer like our Western perspective. So maybe we can address those first.
Yeah, so Christine's response to Laura's question, I think, is certainly appropriate. So there's there is a lot of that sort of dynamic that she described, but in the region where Al-Kharj is, there were not many small farmers in the sense of having even like an individual plot. So you'd have workers that would come work on the farm, but they wouldn't necessarily have any sort of home garden or kitchen garden or something like that. So the small farmers that did not benefit from the various Saudi subsidies, for example, these would be dispersed across various parts of Saudi Arabia. But here in particular, well, at this time in particular, I think most of those smaller farmers would be concentrated further to the east and also to the north. And so there they might be, people that I don't know if that this distinguishing the demographics of this really makes has many equal or comfortable comparisons from the 1940s as you would see today, but certainly just ordinary people who didn't have like a higher education or things like that. So I'm not sure how better to answer Laura's question in that sense, but more like subsistence farmers is what I was meaning here.
I'm muted. Thank you. And next we have a question from Angie Lee, and then I am monitoring the chat as well, and we'll come to you next. Let's see if we can unmute. Angie, go ahead.
Okay, thank you so much for the presentation. And actually, I'm from East Asian Studies, so I'm not exactly in your field, but actually I also approach to the natural resources in my project. So I wonder how you approach to water resource data, especially you mentioned water politics. I wonder, is there any other approaches when you research on the water resources? And my project is based on southeastern region of China, and it's mainly about the landscape water resources, and I try to connect it with religious resources. So basically I have no idea about how to approach to water resources. So wonder if you could give me some suggestions. Thank you.
Yeah, so there's there's lots of ways that one might do that. I mean, in my own research, this project for me is the first time that I've really gone into the weeds with the archival work. So that said, I mean, it is really remarkable how much data you can find about water resources and the water politics through the archives, and not necessarily places that you would always expect. So I've certainly accessed quite a bit of information through the State Department archives, but you can also find that in the archival documents of people like Carl Twitchell and his kind of documentation of the resources during his travels through there. So like through his diaries, for example. So that's obviously one route to it. But in the more contemporary side of the work, I've been looking at sustainability initiatives in the Arabian Peninsula for many years now, almost 10 years that I've been working on this. And so here I'm going to a number of the water conferences and interviewing people in the natural resources sector that are working there and employed there today. So it really just depends on the particular part of the project that you might be working on, but certainly if it's, it depends on your focus. It could be archival, it could be interviews, it could be ethnography. I mean, I think there's a lot of really fantastic work that could and should be done in Arizona, for example, of interviewing various groups in and across the state about how they understand the particular role of these kinds of farming, foreign farms in the state. I was not able to do that for this particular project, but that's something I would have loved to do, to actually go and interview local communities and other people about their attitudes toward it.
Great, thank you. We have a couple more questions. So one from Ian: how is the Arizona project reported in the Saudi Arabia media?
So I don't know, but I don't know which time period he's asking about. So if that's the 1940s time period or if that's the contemporary time period. But I haven't personally found any major accounts of the Arizona farming operation like from the contemporary side of it. What you do see though is a kind of typical fanfare around Almarai and its important role in the region, and sort of glorifying it as a regional actor, and maybe quietly pointing to the Arizona farm, but that usually that's not the priority of that attention. But as for the 40s, I don't know, and I think that's actually a really fantastic question. I would love to know.
Yeah, it would be interesting to see if there's any, other kind of constructs like land grab or, but something going on in the reverse. So Alberto Burques has a question: how do you associate the colonial idea of, quote, desertification with the paradigm of developing wastelands, and how these affected traditional herders in Arabia?
Yeah, that's a really great question, and I actually have another article that I've written, and it's a story that's not in the book. So Alberto, if you're really interested in this, feel free to email me. But the article I have titled as Wastelanding Arabia, and thinking about this in terms of the reference to work on Arizona and the wastelanding of Diné lands in Arizona, and then thinking about that idea of wastelanding through the Al-Kharj project, because what you see in this particular moment in the 1940s and 50s is this construction of the Arabian desert as a wasteland, and this idea that it's a place that needs the corrective of Western agriculture, and this idea that the Americans can introduce this sort of Garden of Eden in Al-Kharj. Like, this is a really, really important storyline that justifies this. You didn't have this idea of desertification that was really dominant at that time in the 1940s and 50s. That comes a little bit later, that sort of catches on later. But at that time, though, you start to see where that story comes from, and it has these deeper roots in these sort of biblical narratives about Eden and the taming of the land through agriculture, which have really important parallels to the history of the United States and the westward expansion around similar ideas of, the idea that we are going to colonize, and by doing that, we're going to make this productive land, we're going to civilize it, and it's going to become this like garden paradise. Through all the agricultural boosterism for promoting Arizona development, you really see that. So the desertification idea, it sort of exists in somehow of a separate intellectual conversation and political conversation, but I think that it is nonetheless tied to this. It is tied to these geographic imaginaries of Eden and of colonization and civilization through agriculture and the sort of green spaces, and so that there absolutely is a connection there, that I think is really important. But I sort of sense that, whose question was this? I lost the question. Alberto's question. I sense that perhaps your question is somewhat more in the more recent kind of direction of this question, that if it really is just the drawing up of the Saudi aquifers and traditional herders that might not have places to water their animals, this obviously is a huge political issue for Saudi Arabia as the water resources dry out. If you're really interested in this, I recommend Toby Craig Jones' book, Desert Kingdom. And there he really talks about these herding communities and what the reconfiguration of the political structure of agriculture does for these communities. But this is not something that I've specifically focused on. So Desert Kingdom is the book to read about that. How Oil and Water Forged Saudi Arabia, I think is the subtitle, something to that effect.
Great, thank you. We have a comment from Mai, who wrote, "Thank you for this amazing presentation. I grew up in the Middle East and Tucson. I grew up eating Almarai products, and it is very interesting to see them set up farms here in Arizona and the political history of Saudi Arabia-Arizona relations. And then there's one other comment about just sustainability and needing to urge our state legislators to pass a bill that regulates rural water.
Yeah, I think that I just want to comment quickly on that. I mean, I think that this is a really important thing because I hadn't been aware of the significance of this really until I started with this project. And many people did, as I said, they told me, like, don't bother with the Saudi story because there's all these other farmers that are like farming operations that are coming from California, especially since they passed the groundwater regulation rules in California, but other parts of the United States, they're coming to take our water, and those are the bigger problem that we have to consider. And so I think what the media has found, though, which is simultaneously frustrating, but also, I don't know, maybe raises the issue to political consciousness, is that the Saudi story helps capture our attention around exactly these kind of legal loopholes that are not being attended to when we think, oh, it's just a farm coming from Minnesota or California. They're not fundamentally different, though, right? Because they're still tapping into the same aquifers, and it is still the same political issue that is at stake here. So just my little 2 cents on that piece. But thank you.
Right, and then Jana just also provided a helpful list of some recent bills that were introduced, so people can check that out. There is a question from Todd. Given the long-term outcomes of using the aquifers, is there any discussion on future solutions in the US or Saudi?
Yes, there are, I would say, they're all kind of, I have a distaste for the sort of techno fetishistic sci-fi approach to things, but these seem to be the favorite ones recently. So I go to a lot of these Gulf water and energy events, and one of the things that they've been talking about, I've sat through presentations on groundwater recharge. So essentially what they're proposing to do is to take desalinated seawater and just pump it underground. Like that's their proposal. So the energy resources to do this are astonishing. There's all sorts of problems with that, but that is nonetheless one of the things that they have been proposing, at least in one of the cases that I've seen in the UAE. They've been talking about this as a water security thing. So they'd have like a strategic reservoir of water. Since we've pumped our aquifers dry, we need to just at least like have the strategic reservoir. And that's one way they've been justifying it. But for the most part, I think the main way that they've been talking about this is not so much about recharging the aquifers, but actually in just investing in new and higher tech and more efficient desalination techniques. So there's plenty of ways that they have been thinking about this, but the desalination is not, I mean, there's not anything dramatically new or more energy efficient that has come on the market in like the 10 or 15 years I've been watching this. So there's some new things, but nothing that would make doing it on a scale that you could use it for agricultural production. It's not reasonable. And so, yeah, the solutions have primarily been to invest abroad. And this is why you saw that shift of subsidies. Instead of focusing on domestic production, go buy foreign farmland and we'll help you do that. But this is also why companies like Almarai, as well as Al Dawra, the Emirati major ag conglomerate, have been investing in becoming major logistics supply companies. So Al Dawra, the Emirati dairy company or Emirati ag conglomerate, they're one of the largest grain exporters in the United States, if not I think they're like always top 1 or 2 grain exporters in the US. But they have branches in all different parts of the world, and so they've been trying to diversify where they can get their food products and grain products in particular. So those are easier solutions than they have, I would say, to how they've been thinking about groundwater recharge.
We have a question from Charles. Thanks for this presentation. Did you find any evidence of initiatives that addressed directly the interests of smallholders and communities in either Saudi Arabia or Arizona? So I guess that's a little bit overlapping, but maybe more broadly addressing those interests of the small farmers and communities.
For this particular project, no. I mean, I think that there are some things, so I don't want to dismiss that, but my attention for this project has not been on exactly that sort of diversity of those approaches. So I'm sure that there are some things there. You know, I think one of the tricky things about the Almarai acquisition of the Vicksburg farm also was just this idea that many of the farmers in that community, they were already sort of looking at the possibility of losing the value of their land because nobody was necessarily going to invest in it and have the money that the Saudis had to drill these new wells that needed to go much deeper. So many of the farming communities simply are not able to access the aquifer water anymore because they don't have the money to drill deeper. So that's one of the big tensions around this, is that it is really kind of a race to the bottom in the sense that unless you gave them the resources to drill deeper wells, and that doesn't seem to be sort of politically palatable, I would suppose.
Great, thank you. There's a comment about, is it desal water? Is that how you say that? Desal water in Saudi is used for agriculture. They have a massive desal infrastructure, and the energy is from methane that would have otherwise been flamed into the atmosphere. So I don't know if you want to comment on that.
Yeah, I mean, I was just in the UAE this past month, and they've been talking about this at many of these events, even this month. It's minimal. It truly is minimal. And so, yeah, I think there was just a recent release, and maybe a couple of weeks ago, of a global sort of mapping of where this methane flaring is happening, and all these places that say they're not flaring methane, they are flaring methane, as it turns out. But the vast majority of Saudi desal plants are not running on methane. They're running on various other things, but that is something that they have proposed. Yes, if they could actually accomplish that, then great. They've also been talking about running these desal plants on solar, and they've been talking about doing this since the 1950s with the University of Arizona's research center that I've looked at for another project a little bit later in the 1950s. They started saying, oh, we're gonna develop solar power desal, and they tried to do this, and it didn't work, and it continues to not work. So there's all sorts of reasons that I could go into for why the solar isn't working either. But yes, there are aspirations for it to become more sustainable, but it also doesn't fundamentally change the situation, and it also doesn't change the situation that what the Gulf countries are really struggling with right now is that they're dumping all the brine from this desalination process. So all of the salt that gets pulled out, they're just dumping it straight back into the Gulf. And then the Gulf region is becoming much more saline, and then this is making it even more energy intensive, and it's just this sort of like deepening cycle. So yes, it would be wonderful if they could make that more efficient and sustainable, but my sense is we're still quite a way from that.
Great, thank you. So we have a comment. So there's a link to an opinion piece about the Arizona possible water solutions. And then we have a question from Jeff Bannister, the director of the Southwest Center, which I'm also excited to hear you address because you've talked about this a little bit elsewhere. Excellent talk, Natalie, thank you. A question, who do you turn to for theoretical support as you were thinking through all of these complex connections across space-time geopolitics? And he said he arrived a bit late, so apologies if you've already addressed it, but I think you kind of addressed it towards the end, but it would be great to hear a little bit more about how you theorize those connections.
Yeah, so thank you. I do try to keep the heavy theory out of the broader public talks, but yeah, I mean, I have been working in the field of geopolitics for quite some time. Certainly with the critical geopolitics research inspired by the early work on critical geopolitics by Jared Toll, among many others. So in sort of political geography, there are plenty of people that have been doing unique, interesting approaches to geopolitics whose work I pull from. But beyond that, I would say I have learned a lot and thought through a lot of these concepts through diverse fields, well beyond geography. So, you know, one of the scholars that I have been thinking about this particular framing of Arid empire through is Rob Nixon and his idea of, you know, sort of post-colonial pastoral view, and sort of thinking about how you can see the past and the present together through reading landscapes in a particular way that helps you understand that colonial past and that colonial present. There are also plenty of scholars, including at the University of Arizona, like Andrew Curley, who are working on indigenous geographies and thinking about the broader politics of the history of Arizona and water and the land relations. That has been really formative for me, and plenty of other scholars that are working on deserts in various ways. So the conference that Robin mentioned at the beginning, that we started with a group of scholars looking at deserts comparatively. There's really an impressive number of people who have been working in this direction. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. For the non-geographers among us, can you say the name again? You said Toll? What?
Oh, yes, Jared Toll. So I can put his name in the chat. So he is... So that's the anglicized version of his name. He's Irish, and will often publish under his sort of Irish traditional name. So I actually would have to copy and paste that with all the apostrophes in it. But his book is Critical Geopolitics, and that's the one that is sort of one of the foundational texts for political geographers who are interested in thinking about geopolitics that is not just it's not just about state-to-state relations, but understanding geography as a power knowledge relationship. So Foucauldian inspired type approach that has spawned a whole sort of subfield within political geography. So yeah, there's the other name that you'll see him published under in the chat.
Cool, thank you. Well, it looks like the questions have slowed down and we're at 11 minutes past the hour, and I want to be respectful of your time and everyone else's. So I think we'll go ahead and wrap up, but thank you. This was fascinating. I'm so glad that you could do this and that you're here in Arizona and that we get to visit tomorrow. I'm looking forward to that. And please do send us when your book is out, and we'll make sure to announce that in the Southwest Center newsletter and blast that on social media as well. So many thanks everybody for being here. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, everyone.